Welcome to the Capacity Building course for participants to the Living Lab. I'm Annelies Broekman from CREAF and we'll talk about measures for adaptation to global change. The objective of this presentation is to support the Living Lab process of fact sheet elaboration by introducing basic concepts on adaptation to climate change. We'll clarify the concept of global change and climate change, and we'll introduce the impacts of climate change in the Mediterranean region. Then, we'll introduce some basic concepts needed when dealing with adaptation, how to define and analyze adaptation measures, as well as some advice on how to avoid common errors. This information is key for the Living Lab process, as the working groups are invited to develop fact sheets describing potential adaptation measures to be applied in a Tunisian context. Indeed, the content included in each one of the fact sheets that will be developed then need to take into consideration the information on adaptation measures included in this presentation. The first concept we'd like to present is the term global change. It refers to large-scale changes in society and the subsequent effects on the environment. Changes in climate, changes in land use, and demographic changes shape the world we live in. Some global indicators can help to understand these trends. The world's population has increased steadily during centuries, and so did the economy to sustain this population. As you can see, an exponential economic development arose after the Industrial Revolution in the 50s. This economic development needs input from natural resources, such as dams for generating electricity and irrigation, or water consumption for sustaining all these new production processes, such as cars and telephones, or to sustain new habits, like international tourism. Also, the global biophysical indicators show drastic changes, and since the Industrial Revolution, the concentration of CO2 has increased exponentially, as well as methane concentration, changes in the ozone layer, as well as most important ecosystems, like the depletion of fish population, rainforest, leading to mass extinctions of species. So, what do all these changes mean? The indicators show that we're facing the effects of an exponential increase of resource depletion to sustain an exponential economic development. The effects of this situation are serious and need to be tackled with urgency. As Mauro Guillén states, governments will no longer be able to take for granted the relative environmental stability that has allowed human society to flourish and led to rapid globalization. For all this, we'd like to stress that the focus on climate change should be embedded in an integrated view, taking into consideration broader societal issues that are both driving and impacted by the change. Climate change is one key element of global change and can be taken into account thanks to the scientific information available. Climate variables have an impact on all social and economic activities, changing the current conditions and influencing future trends. Therefore, we speak about the need to adapt to these changes. In the following slides, we want to present the main information available on climate change impacts in the Mediterranean region, retrieved from a recent publication by the Union for the Mediterranean. Here it is shown that temperature in the region is steadily rising, and without additional mitigation measures in place, the temperature will rise by 2.2 degrees Celsius by 2040. Looking to precipitation, the observed precipitation trends in the Mediterranean are characterized by high variability in space and in time, but climate models clearly indicate a trend towards reduced rainfall in coming decades. It is important to understand all variables are interconnected and influence each other. Therefore, it is important to be aware that for each degree of global warming, mean rainfall will likely decrease by about 4% in much of the region. Temperature and precipitation changes are already having a strong impact on the Mediterranean Sea. The temperature of seawater has been rising by 0.4 degrees per decade since 1985 and is expected to continue. During the last 2 decades, Mediterranean sea level rise reached about 3 millimeters per year. Moreover, it's important to mention the process of acidification of seawater, which is an effect of CO2 absorption and leads to the degradation of its habitats. These climatic changes strongly affect our livelihoods and means for production. Maybe one of the most perceived impacts is water availability for human consumption, strongly reduced by the interaction of 3 main factors: precipitation decrease, temperature increase, and population growth. But not only the quantity of water decreases, but also its quality deteriorates because of overexploitation, pollution, and other pressures, making water unsuitable for uses and so reducing its availability for humans and ecosystems even more. Here we present a figure showing the water stress index. It shows the degree of imbalance between water available and water demand. As you can see, the southern part of the Mediterranean is the most affected. It is important to understand that we will need to manage water demand accordingly. For example, irrigation represents between 50 and 90% of the total Mediterranean water demand and is projected to increase between 4 and 18% by the end of the century due to climate change alone, for 2 degrees Celsius and 3 degrees Celsius warming, respectively. But if we take into consideration also the other elements of global change, like population growth and increased demand for food products, these figures may increase to between 22% and 74%. In the same line, impacts on food production are already perceived and are expected to increase in the coming years. Unexpected production losses will be more frequent and crop yield variability will increase. This can be exacerbated by more frequent crop pests and mycotoxins. Strong changes in the life cycle of crops will lead to changes in the agronomic calendar, which will in turn influence the marketability of products. Changes in production conditions are also foreseen for extensive livestock production that will become heavily dependent on feed grain. All these aspects will put an extra pressure on farmers and rural societies, increasing poverty and rural exodus. Also, aquaculture and fishing activities in the region are strongly impacted mostly by overfishing, coastal development, and acidification. The impacts on ecosystems are equally concerning. The coupled effect of warming and drought is expected to lead to a general increase in aridity and subsequent desertification of many Mediterranean land ecosystems. This will lead to extra pressure on delicate ecosystems such as oases. The region will experience increased forest loss and tree mortality. Furthermore, changes in climatic conditions will induce changes in the sustainability of tree species, moving the distribution of trees in the territory. An increased risk of wildfires is also expected. Another crucial aspect is that the adaptation in plants' phenology can decouple their interacting organisms such as insect pollinators. All these disruptions in ecosystems will eventually change the habitat different species need and favor invasive species to colonize new environments. Also, our habitat is affected by the impacts of climate change. Therefore, aspects related to human health and security need to be taken into consideration. Health is affected by increased exposition to heat and solar radiation, but also more complex issues like increasing vector and water-borne diseases. The degradation of the air, soil, and water is increasing the intoxication of our bodies and affecting our health, as well as meeting basic needs will be increasingly difficult for many communities in the Mediterranean region. In terms of security, it is key to establish mechanisms to deal with more frequent extreme climatic phenomena, like prolonged droughts, storms, and floods. Situations like that induce social instability, conflict, and migration because of the loss of livelihood. For example, in North African countries, 1 meter sea level rise will impact approximately 41,500 square kilometers of the territory and at least 37 million people, approximately an 11%. Therefore, I think this cartoon is really appropriate. It indicates a basic oxymoron that climate change is caused by human activity and inaction. Let us now dive into more details and start dealing with basic concepts for adaptation to climate change. With the term risk, we refer to the potential for adverse consequences where something of value is at stake and where the occurrence and degree of an outcome is uncertain. In the context of climate change, we refer to climate-related hazards or the effects of adaptation or mitigation solutions on all aspects of life. Risk results from the interaction of vulnerability of the affected system, its exposure over time to the hazard, as well as the climate-related hazard and the likelihood of its occurrence. So, what is vulnerability? The term refers to their propensity or predisposition to be adversely affected, determined by 3 factors: exposure to hazards, for example, reduced rainfall; sensitivity to those hazards, for example, an economy dominated by rain-fed agriculture; and capacity to adapt to those hazards, also called coping capacity. For example, whether farmers have the money or skills to grow more drought-resistant crops. In this figure, you can appreciate how the concepts interrelate. Environmental degradation, climate change, and socio-political instability are factors that determine a hazard. The level of risk is determined in accordance with the values at stake and capacity to respond. Another key concept is that of resilience, where we refer to the capacity of social, economic, and environmental systems to cope with a hazardous event or trend or disturbance, responding or reorganizing in ways that maintain their essential function, identity, and structure, while also maintaining the capacity for adaptation, learning, and transformation. And now the concept of adaptation, where we refer to the process of adjustment to actual or expected climate and its effects. In human systems, adaptation actions aim to moderate harm or exploit beneficial opportunities for human communities and livelihoods. In natural systems, the process of adjustment to actual climate and its effects follows the rules of ecology regardless of the ecosystem services these systems provide for human communities. Human interventions on ecosystems adaptation mostly focus on recovering the ecosystem services functionality and build ecological resilience for key systems. So, what is an adaptation option, measure, or action? And what about mitigation? Mitigation measures are those actions that are taken to reduce and curb greenhouse gas emissions, while adaptation measures are based on reducing vulnerability to the effects of climate change. Mitigation, therefore, attends to the causes of climate change, while adaptation addresses its impacts. Adaptation measures can help reduce vulnerability, for example, by lowering sensitivity or building adaptive capacity, as well as allowing populations to benefit from opportunities of climatic changes, such as growing new crops in areas that were previously unsuitable. How are adaptation measures used? Adaptation measures are mostly embedded in an adaptation strategy, including a series of synergetic measures. Therefore, when designing potential adaptation measures, it is needed to keep in mind the whole process. The main steps to develop are to define and describe extensively the adaptation measure, then to apply evaluation criteria needed to assess trade-offs, synergies, and cross-cutting issues. After this information is made available, it will be possible to select the most suitable measures to be included in the adaptation strategy, as well as to provide a roadmap for implementation engaging all relevant actors. Furthermore, it is crucial to include a specific section in the strategy and its implementation roadmap on how to follow up and evaluate the impact of the measure. In this course, we'll focus on the first step and introduce elements of the second step. In the FASR Project e-learning platform, you can find a specialized training course, Innovation in Governance for Adaptation, to get an overview of the other steps. So, in order to identify the best adaptation solutions, we should be able to compare and prioritize adaptation options. Indeed, all eligible options should be characterized as concretely as possible, indicating the general aim of the adaptation option, its spatial scope, some indication on social, economic, and ecological context, the necessary steps of implementation and maintenance, as well as the responsible actors and supportive actors for the implementation, the financial resources required, and a time frame and vision for planning and implementing to be fully effective. So, how can we classify the different kinds of adaptation measures? There are many different ways, but the EC main approach defines the adaptation measures in 3 categories. Grey measures refer to technological and engineering solutions to improve adaptation of territory, infrastructures, and people. Green measures are based on the ecosystem-based or nature-based approach and make use of the multiple services provided by natural ecosystems to improve resilience and adaptation capacity. Soft measures include policy, legal, social, management, and financial measures that can alter human behavior and styles of governance, contributing to improve adaptation capacity and to increase awareness on climate change issues. It can sometimes be challenging to allocate adaptation options and actions to one specific cluster, as adaptation responses often are a combination of measures and therefore are bound to include to some extent gray, green, or soft elements. Furthermore, some adaptation options are interrelated. For instance, institutions and informations are prerequisites for effective early warning systems. If you want to know more about these aspects, the European Climate Adaptation Platform is a resource tool and the European Union entry point to information and knowledge based on climate adaptation. It includes indicators, case studies, state of play of European Union and national policies, and supporting instruments. Climate Adapt aims to strengthen information and knowledge sharing across stakeholders at all levels of governance in Europe. Let's provide some examples of grey measures. Engineered built environment, like seawalls and coastal protection structures or flood levees or dams and irrigation channels, but also other less hard infrastructure, like beach nourishment or floating houses. Technological solutions are also considered as grey, including water-saving technologies, mechanical and passive cooling, renewable energy production, and many more. Green measures are also called nature-based solutions, defined as actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity effects. Examples are crop diversification, reinforcing natural defenses such as dunes or wetlands, maintaining and restoring healthy ecosystems, enhancing the ability of indigenous plant and animal species to move across landscapes without interruption by man-made obstacles. In the European context, when green adaptation actions are integrated into a spatially organized plan, they are known as green infrastructure. We invite you to explore the most famous example, the Room for the River, program developed in the Netherlands. Soft measures typically include normative and economic instruments, such as, for example, applying changes in legislation, establish water demand management programs and tools to reduce water consumption, or reorganize the spatial planning of an area. This category also includes economic instruments like market strategies, tariffs, taxes, subsidies, and insurance. In the European context, natural hazards, monitoring, and early warning systems are very much promoted as soft measures, as well as awareness raising and public information campaigns about climate-related risk. In this sense, we can consider our activities creating a living lab for farmer advisory in Tunisia as a soft adaptation measure. Let's make some considerations on general features of the categories explained. Gray measures like high technological instruments or big infrastructure are often expert-driven, capital-intensive, large-scale, and highly complex, meaning these measures are developed by central state administrations and engineers, and little input can be included from other actors. Moreover, these approaches are extensions and improvements of existing practices, plans, and structures, although some newer projects are now integrating change climate risk into the initial design. In order to make a good project based on gray measures, it is important to keep in mind two general limitations of gray measures to phase adaptation. The project design must cope with uncertainties associated with projecting climate impacts arising from assumptions about future weather, population growth, and human behavior, and the longevity and cost of engineered infrastructure affect the feasibility at the outset. High-tech and innovative technological solutions typically need more funding and require more research, experience, and training to be implemented than more traditional gray measures. Green and soft measures specifically aim at decreasing the sensitivity and increasing the adaptive capacity of human and natural systems to build resilience. These actions are often less resource-intensive and provide multiple benefits, as they aim to restore and preserve ecosystems' functions. Green measures are also very complex to design, and this is a whole new research field. Therefore, we suggest to take a look at the following websites: Think Nature and OPA platform, developed for knowledge transfer on green measures. Or this website, Nature-Based Solutions Initiative, where you can also find an evidence platform, an interactive map linking nature-based solutions to climate change adaptation outcomes based on a systematic review of the peer-reviewed literature. There are many other variables that are used to describe adaptation solutions. In example, flexibility and robustness. Flexible adaptation measures are defined as actions that take into account current knowledge but can be changed in accordance to unpredicted conditions. It generally refers to adaptation processes, like an incremental set of actions for transformation. For example, the development of an adaptation strategy or changing crops are flexible actions. Deconstruction of a water transfer infrastructure is not. Robust adaptation measures are defined as actions that maintain the expected impact under a wide range of possible climate change scenarios, like, for example, wetland restoration projects or the prohibition to build dwellings in a floodplain. Another characteristic of an adaptation measure can be defined as demand-side or supply-side oriented. Demand-side measures are policies and programs for influencing the demand for goods and/or services. For example, reducing the demand for water required for domestic or productive uses. Supply-side measures are policies and programs for influencing how a certain demand for goods and/or services is met. For example, increasing water provision stability through desalination plant. Another way to define measures is based on the approach adopted. Accepting the impacts and bearing the losses that result from risks. For example, managing retreat from sea level rise. Offsetting losses by sharing or spreading risks. For example, through insurance. Avoiding or reducing exposure to climate risks. For example, building new flood defenses or changing location or activity. Exploiting new opportunities. For example, engaging in a new activity or changing practices to take advantage of changing climatic conditions. Here we provide an example of a fact sheet containing the complete description of an adaptation measure. The title, "The Climate Change Addressed," a general aim and a specific description of the main actions it will entail. It contains information on the social, economic, and ecological context where the measure is proposed. Its spatial scope, series of descriptors using the international categories we described for defining the type of measures, the responsible actors to be engaged in the implementation process and their role, as well as an estimation of the costs. This can be done even if exact information is not available, using cost ranges to be later validated by the responsible administrations. It's also important to highlight the expected benefits and barriers to implementation, provided these aspects help to establish potential synergies and conflicts with other measures of the same set. Finally, it is important to include an estimation on the timeframe needed to implement the solution. Here we present an example of a fact sheet on potential adaptation measures to be selected for adapting to the sea level rise in coastal areas. We consider it a good example as it shows different characteristics of the solutions, as well as an indication on their complementarity. Indeed, as we remarked earlier, the adaptation measures are managed in sets. Therefore, it is crucial to get a clear picture of the interactions between them through analyzing cross-cutting issues, trade-offs, and synergies. Therefore, the assessment of possible options and their comparison should include identifying the risks the option addresses. For example, each option may have an effect on or treat multiple risks, and by how much the option will reduce the risk. The latter also referred to as effectivity. Considering the time frame to implement the option and when it shall become effective, reflecting identified risks and the range of urgency to act. Addressing direct and indirect effects of the option in economic, environmental, and social terms, including effects on climate change mitigation, with an emphasis on potential benefits. Also referred to as equity, when referred to impacts on vulnerable communities. In the same line, it is crucial to assess costs and benefits to predict whether the benefits, for example avoided damage, of an option outweigh its cost, and by how much in relation to other alternatives. For example, one can rank alternate options in terms of the cost-benefit ratio. All costs and benefits should be quantified where it is possible and meaningful. Otherwise, a qualitative assessment shall be delivered. Furthermore, it is needed to consider the barriers to implementation of adaptation actions, including budget required, the need of a policy change or introduction of legislation, the expected level of acceptance to stakeholders, as well as the extent of research and development needed. Why did we insist so much on analyzing synergies and trade-offs? Because if this is not done, it is easy to incur in a case of maladaptation. We define maladaptation as actions that may lead to increased risk of adverse climate-related outcomes, including via increased GHG emissions, increased vulnerability to climate change, or diminished welfare, now or in the future. Maladaptation is usually an unintended consequence. Barnett and O'Neill indicate 5 dimensions of maladaptation, highlighting actions can increase emissions of GHGs, disproportionately burden the most vulnerable, have high opportunity cost, reduce incentives and capacity to adapt, and set paths that limit future choices. Maladaptation arises in many forms, but several broad causes can be identified. Actions that may benefit a particular group or sector at a particular time may prove to be maladaptive to those same groups or sectors in future climates or to other groups or sectors in existing climates. For example, soft development policies and measures that deliver short-term benefits or economic gains but lead to greater vulnerability in the medium to long term, such as in cases where the construction of hard infrastructure reduces the flexibility and the range of future adaptation options. Another common case is related to adaptation efforts aimed at armoring the coastline, which may result in coastal erosion elsewhere along the coast. Or when building leaves along a flood-prone area, these provide protection to coastal population and infrastructure, but might encourage unwanted development within that area, often accentuated by an exaggerated sense of safety. And the leaves may increase damage when they fail, as in Bangladesh in 1999 and New Orleans in 2003. Agricultural policies that promote the growing of high-yielding crop varieties through subsidies with the objective of boosting production and increasing revenues may achieve these objectives in the short term, but will also reduce agrodiversity and increase exposure and vulnerability of monocrops to climate change, and finally undermine the adaptive capacity of farmers in the long term. Another cause of maladaptation is the failure to account for multiple interactions and feedbacks between systems and sectors, leading to inadequate or inaccurate information for developing adaptive response. Here, we present the example of the Mar Menor case in Spain. In a very unique location, touristic facilities and intensive agriculture were developed to boost local economy. A lot of climate-friendly policies were promoted in the area. Water saving in hotels is the highest in Spain, as well as the public funding provided to farmers to increase the technification of their plots with the aim to reduce resource input and pollution. The interactions between urban and agricultural developments were not accounted for, resulting in one of the major economic collapses in recent European environmental history. Therefore, let's make sure we can consolidate the main points presented to fit into our Living Lab process and provide the best possible knowledge for improving adaptation in Tunisian agriculture. We saw global change calls for societal transformation, and that climate change impacts in the Mediterranean are severe and are expected to increase in the near future. Therefore, it is urgent to adapt to new conditions as to reduce impact on our society. Adaptation measures need to be designed taking into account numerous factors, and in order to identify adaptation measures, these need to be well characterized and described. We stated it is crucial to take into account that different typologies of adaptation measures imply different opportunities and barriers. Assessing the relation between adaptation measures is crucial for estimating expected impacts. All developments promoted need to acknowledge the most frequent mistakes and avoid maladaptation. Thank you very much for your attention and don't hesitate to contact us for any further clarification needed.